So welcome everybody. This is the second webinar in the series with Michael Barnard. And so today we're focused once again on our global situation, and Michael will be talking about that. So just a few proposed regulations and guidelines. So please, when it comes to questions, last time we had a little bit of confusion. We did ask people to use the Q&A. You can put if you use the Zoom hand up thing, that's the best way because it actually moves you up to the top left corner so we can see who's there. And so I would advise that, if possible, to use that Q&A or the React. You can do both, in fact. So without further ado, though, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Byrne, who will introduce our guest speaker, Michael Barnard.
Oh, great. Wonderful to see everyone. Yeah, it's a pleasure to welcome Michael back to SCAN and actually El Rasa, because this is actually sponsored by a retired faculty association at the University of Lethbridge as well. Yeah, and I tried to get a national association, but they're very busy, but hopefully we'll bring them into future groups. But anyway, so yes, Michael is a good friend of mine. He's also recognized around the world for his work on practical decarbonization technologies, policies, programs that work at real scale, that operate at real scale. Mike and I always get together for a few beers whenever I'm in British Columbia, and I must admit, it's wonderful how in British Columbia there's such a plethora of fine establishments that make microbrews. And so we get to share some of those, and we have some great conversations about engineering, markets, and again what actually works for dealing with climate change. So Mike brings a real curiosity and a rigor to those conversations, and he brings that to his publications and his global advisory work as well. He regularly is engaged by executives, investors, policymakers on decarbonization pathways that can be deployed now, not in the future and not unpromising or not unproven technologies. He focuses on what works now, and what doesn't work now too. So if you ever want to, get some of Mike's really good writings, just search his name and whatever, put in carbon capture and storage, and you'll find out how badly it fails us if despite what they say in Alberta, and many other topics. So Mike, he's not at all shy about engaging in difficult, controversial discussions and debates. He's published many well-researched analyses that challenge unsupported claims from industry, government, from NGOs. Yeah, I could go on in that, but this is Michael's day. His work examines the real-world viability of solutions and non-solutions that might include natural gas, LNG, carbon capture, hydrogen, nuclear energy, and how they might or might not meet current and future needs. So through his writing, his advisory work, Mike has contributed to an evidence-based conversation on how experienced citizens can apply their knowledge, resources, and networks to accelerate the clean energy transition. So it's wonderful again to welcome Michael Barnard here to talk to us today, and good to see you, Michael, and welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I'll pop my slides up here. Good to be back. I was here a month ago, for those of you who were here a month ago, talking kind of about the global perspective of pockets of the future. And the focus today is on Canada, specific things that, where Canada is, and some things to think about as we think about Canada. Now, the pockets of the future stuff that I did last time, the theme is we have all the solutions for 98% of decarbonization. They are proven at scale in countries around the world. There's nothing that's not proven. We don't need to do pilots. We just need to pick stuff and implement it that works. There's just an entire plethora of solutions, and there's a bunch that are homegrown. So I'm going to speak for perhaps 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. So let's start with the basics. Canada is actually really well positioned for this in a few ways. We have some of the lowest carbon electricity in the world in our major, our biggest provinces. Quebec and BC have some very low carbon electricity. Manitoba has about the lowest carbon electricity I've seen in the entire world with their big hydro resources. Ontario's electricity is pretty good, although they're going in the wrong direction with more and more gas-powered generation. So that's problematic. But Ontario also got rid of its coal plants back in the 2000s, getting rid of about 37 million tons of CO2 per year. One of the biggest single interventions in terms of decarbonization I've seen. Sadly, Alberta and Saskatchewan have completely removed any benefits that we've gained in other provinces in decarbonization by increasing their carbon emissions. But that's temporary. We also have across Canada rail. We also have more than enough land for all the wind and solar we need. I'll just say, I was in the Netherlands last year, which is about the size of half of the lower mainland of British Columbia, from Hope over to the island. And they have gigawatt scale wind, solar, and battery farms. They have they actually at one point had more rooftop solar than Australia. So we have all the space we need for clean energy. And we have all the space we need for pumped hydro storage and batteries and transmission. The only thing that's stopping us is willpower. It's certainly not availability. We also have an enormous amount of critical minerals that are necessary for the electrification in the future. So we can be a real powerhouse in terms of minerals, extraction, processing, and refining, and some manufacturing from those minerals. There's a lot of advantages we have. That said, we're not doing enough. We're not doing it quickly. But let's talk about some of the other pieces that we've got here. So this is a Sankey diagram. It's an energy flow diagram invented by a Scottish guy with 7 names or something like that. I can never keep them straight. The last one was Sankey, which is why it's called the Sankey diagram. I tend to do these not only for current energy flows for areas, for jurisdictions I'm engaging with, but I also then turn them into the future decarbonized energy flows. So the way to read this is primary energy comes in on the left, and it flows through conversions like refining or electrical generation. It flows into energy use cases where actual useful energy is consumed that does something. And then it flows into one of 2 categories: rejected energy, which is energy that is wasted because it's just waste heat, or useful energy, which is stuff that we actually got some value out of. Now, this is the future version, and it has 1,000 terawatt hours of useful energy consumed by our society in Canada. That's actually what it was in 2024. But the energy flow diagram for today's energy system had 1,500 terawatt hours of wasted, rejected energy. In a future electrified system that's fed dominantly by renewable forms of electricity, you'll notice how much lower the rejected energy is than 1,500 terawatt hours. It really does invert that. An electrified economy powered by renewables is a vastly more efficient economy. That's because the Carnot cycle and the diesel cycle, all the things that power internal combustion engines and thermal generation, well, they're pretty wasteful. This mix of forms of energy is sufficient to provide all the energy services we consume today with all the economic benefits and vastly fewer negative externalities. About 300 terawatt hours of wind, 180 terawatt hours of solar, a bunch of hydro. I left the nuclear in there because Ontario has extended its nuclear plants long past the time when they might be reasonable to retire, but we're still going to have nuclear in a few years. Ambient heat increases a lot, and biomass for biofuels for aviation and shipping increase a lot. That's kind of the energy mix of the future. And I'll talk about some more of those things. In order to take advantage of that, we need to build out transmission across Canada much more robustly than it is. And the good news is there's some stuff that's going on right now. Carney's budget and efforts, one of the key things in there is that now clean energy tax credits can be taken by crown corporations that build transmission. That wasn't possible previously. The clean energy tax credits couldn't be taken by the crown corporations that do the transmission building. So now they have a new funding mechanism for long-term funding of transmission. That's going to unlock several projects. I've identified 5 projects that are key interconnectors and that can become the incremental creation of the second golden spike. And the second golden spike project that I talk about is a HVDC transmission across Canada, high voltage, direct current, low losses, so that electrons can flow easily from where they're in surplus to where they're needed with low losses. That requires more transmission or better transmission, and there's a bunch of techniques we can use. We can use grid enhancing technologies like dynamic line rating, reconductoring on existing transmission, and we can reuse the corridors for high voltage direct current transmission, much bigger pipes for electrons. So, one of the things SCAN can get behind potentially across Canada is countering NIMBYism about transmission, engaging in terms of activities to promote transmission and grid enhancing technologies. Talking to your MPs and stuff about things like that to push this forward. It's the same thing as countering anti-wind stuff and anti-solar stuff. There needs to be some effort put into that among civil society to move those forward. Batteries, similar story. Batteries are a global extraordinary success story, massive growth in batteries, because they can be used for all sorts of things. If transmission is a little bit tight, they can be used for buffering at either end. They can be used to move solar into the evening hours when it's required. They can be used for ancillary services like frequency and voltage control to keep the grid running smoothly at the rate 60 hertz, 60 cycles per second. And one of the things, there's a lot of disinformation about batteries and fires right now. I did an analysis of the California battery fire you guys may have heard about last year. The batteries replaced a natural gas plant. The natural gas plant was running at 60% capacities, fouling the air and causing health impacts on the local community. The battery fire was one transient thing, was over quickly, caused zero chemical impacts or health impacts on the local communities. And yet people are afraid of batteries. So, there's a great amount of work to do to demystify batteries, to demystify grid batteries, to fight against stupid setbacks for grid batteries that are emerging. And to, I'm just going to say this bluntly, counter the fire department's love of terrorizing people in order to increase their budgets.
Heavy.
I think someone is reading to a grandchild. If you could put yourself on mute.
They've been muted. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you. So battery storage has gone up by leaps and bounds. We're now seeing up to 10-hour battery storage systems. That's verging into long duration storage. They've become so cheap. One of the things I say to people is if you're not paying close attention to solar and batteries, everything you think you know is wrong. They've just become so cheap that it's now worth putting solar on the sides of buildings, using it as fencing material. And batteries have just become an extraordinary enabler of decarbonization. Now, one of the things for Canada, we actually are one of the global leaders on mass timber construction. Mass timber is plywood on steroids. Basically, you can create structural beams and full floors routed out for wiring and plumbing fittings and windows and doors. You can you can put them together like Lego at the site and construct a building with 6, basically carpenters assembling panels and beams at the site. A much smaller number of trades. The buildings can go up a lot faster. Structurally, mass timber is Um, the same strength as reinforced concrete as at a fifth the mass of mass timber. And so what you get up is a much lighter building, so your foundations are lighter. And this enables us to avoid the use of cement, of reinforced concrete, which is a bit of a carbon bomb. And so mass timber, we're the world's tallest mass timber building, 50 stories, is already under construction. But we actually have 700 buildings in Canada which use mass timber in various forms, cross-laminated timber, or mass timber, or engineered hardwood. There's a bunch of names for it, and different techniques of putting it together. But as we move forward, one of the key things is to take advantage of it. Now, Kearney's housing policy is targeted at the bottom 20% of the socioeconomic ladder with social housing, multi-unit residential buildings, and about $7 billion in funding for it. He was targeting $13 billion, but the budget only managed to scrape out $7 billion. But that's a seed for private investment in the space to create affordable, excellent housing for the underhomed, but also to create an industry around mass timber that enables us to get a high value add for our forestry resources, which enables the forestry firms to actually invest in sustainable forestry. Right now, we are selling to the lowest bidder and the lowest common denominator with low value add timber products. And that's making it very hard for the firms to actually have profits sufficient and revenue sufficient to invest in what we need to do to protect and make sustainable our forests. Every ton of mass timber actually has about a ton of carbon dioxide from the air. Breathes in the CO2, breathes out the oxygen, keeps the carbon as a structural member. But we don't double count. We count forests already, so we can't double count the timber. And there's 5 different ways to get rid of the timber at end of life when we just take the building down, so that it isn't re-releasing that timber to the atmosphere. I'm just going to say this is a really blatantly obvious one, but if heat pumps are an amazing technology. They're vastly more efficient. They work in vastly colder climates than they used to. If you've got forced air in a home, they plug and play with the forced air and just make it very easy. It's actually much easier to put in heat pumps in Canada than it is in the UK, where they have a lot of radiator water systems, or in New York City, where they have a bunch of steam systems. But in Canada's homes, great way, if you've got central air, you can turn that into a heat pump. Central air conditioning, you can turn that into a heat pump quite trivially. And there's all sorts of things there to smooth that out. So from a scan perspective, as a technology enabler, you can think about what the UK did. The UK changed regulations in 2 ways and really reap benefits from increased deployment of heat pumps. What they did is they removed property line setbacks and also the number of heat pumps that were allowable on a property. And they reset that as a performance-based mandate for 43 decibels at neighbors' windows. And so that performance-based mandate, because heat pumps have become so high-end, enabled people to put the heat pumps on their property and put a sufficient number of heat pumps for multi-unit residential buildings or for larger buildings, thermal loads. That helped. The second thing they did was to remove the requirement for a retrofit of the envelope of the building before they would provide a grant for a heat pump. The fabric first is a bit of a trap. Anybody here who has been doing building envelope efficiency stuff, the reality is that if you're burning natural gas and you do an envelope retrofit, globally the data says, well, we get a strong rebound effect. People just turn up the heat and leave the windows open more, or wear shorts, and they just keep thermal comfort by burning more gas. And so they, in one major study in the UK, there was, after 4 years, exactly the same amount of gas being burned by the 55,000 houses in the study. So electrify buildings, do the insulation retrofits as minimal to maximize the budgetary value of the intervention. But SCAN could be making sure that that insulation isn't required before the heat pump is permitted for that granting, and looking at local zoning bylaws to make sure that there aren't restrictions on heat pumps that are unrealistic or problematic that prevent people from adopting them in different places. This is another boring one. Moving goods with and people with electricity is really obvious. Transportation, ground transportation, especially individual cars, represents about 70% of all the oil consumption globally. Powering that with our low emissions grid electricity is vastly more efficient, wind turbine to wheel, than cars are well to wheel, and vastly lower emissions. And vastly cheaper for us as well. Our electricity is pretty cheap outside of Saskatchewan and Alberta, which have the highest electricity prices in Canada, of course, because they're heavy, fossil fuels on their grids. It's a lovely counter in Canada. If anybody says renewables are expensive, well, Alberta and Saskatchewan have the highest electricity prices and the least renewables. What are you saying? But electric buses are growing. They're growing fast. Don't get seduced by hydrogen buses and requirements in Canada. Carbon in China is about the same climate as Edmonton. It has a globally respected massive ice festival that covers hectares. It's really cold, and all their buses are electric. They just insulate them because they need to. They have heat pumps, and they have radiant heaters on the inside, and they work just fine. There's all sorts of ways around it. In-motion charging gets rid of most of the range concerns and the energy demand concerns from winter use. In-motion charging basically has a bus with a potentially smaller battery than normal, but it has trolley overhead capability. And so for some parts of the journey, it actually has overhead wires it can get its motive power from and charge its batteries. Any place there's a hill going up, like out here, one of the hydrogen people a couple of weeks ago at a conference told me, well, battery electric buses can't get up to SFU. Well, in-motion charging allows battery electric buses to get up to SFU, and it doesn't have to be everywhere. We don't need downtown Vancouver's trolley wires everywhere. So yeah, very basic stuff. Another thing that is very important, we have a lot of emissions of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, from our fossil fuel infrastructure. Unfortunately, we didn't adopt Norwegian or Northern European standards for infrastructure. We adopted North American, United States standards. And what that means is that we flare a lot of methane, we vent a lot of methane. When a pipe is depressurized for maintenance, the methane is just vented to the atmosphere as business as usual. We have a lot of actuators on our pipes that use pressure from the pressurized natural gas in the pipes to do certain classes of things and to maintain pressure. And there's a whole bunch of technologies that can be used to do that, but there has to be the political will to force the use of those technologies. And there has to be a bunch of stuff to change the operational patterns of them. There has to be a bunch of stuff. One of the examples I remember is neighbors were complaining about the flaring and high efficiency flares, which are preventing methane from being released to the atmosphere by turning into carbon dioxide. Imperfect, but better than the alternative. And so the operator turned off the flare and just vented the methane to the atmosphere to be a good neighbor. So there's a bunch of stupid stuff that happens around methane that we can fix in Canada. And we have a big fossil fuel industry. I will say that our worst emissions are from the, CHOPS, cold, heavy oil processing with sand in southern Alberta, near the border of Saskatchewan. On both sides of the border, there's some of these things, big methane bombs. But we also have methane emissions problems from other places. So, strongly focused on that is good. Similarly, in agriculture globally, when I spoke to the head of the Global Carbon Project, a research initiative that does global carbon budgets for all greenhouse gases, including methane. He pointed out that in their budget, from our land use, we actually get more methane than we do from our fossil fuel industry. And a lot of that comes from, 3 or 4 things in agriculture. One of the big ones is ammonia-based fertilizers. Ammonia-based fertilizers, when they're put on the land, if they're quick release ammonia fertilizers, which a lot are, then they turn into nitrous oxides. And nitrous oxides are 265 times the global warming potential as carbon dioxide, and they last a long time. So they're real climate bombs. There are slower releasing fertilizers, which oxamides, which should be being pushed for in Canadian agriculture. But that's the back end of the thing. The front end of the thing is we make methane, we make ammonia for fertilizers from natural gas in Canada, mostly in Alberta. And that's every, a ton of ammonia turns into 6 to 8 tons of carbon dioxide just to make it. And plus the upstream methane emissions from the natural gas. So that's a place where we strongly have to be pushing for, decarbonizing that with green hydrogen for the most part. We're not going to get that in Alberta or Saskatchewan because they're oil and gas people. So we're going to want to go with blue hydrogen. It's not going to be as low. It's not going to be nearly as low emissions as green hydrogen-based ammonia, but it'll be better than nothing, and it'll be what they can do or what they will do. So there's stuff to push for there. And similarly, cattle barns, there's a problem with dairy barns, and there's a problem with cattle in general. There's a couple of things you can do there. One of them is there's a seaweed-derived feed supplement for cattle that reduces methane burps from ungulates by 60 to 80%. Proven, available now, should be mandated. Once a week, feed supplements for cattle reduces methane emissions from cattle by over 50%. It's a no-brainer. We should be requiring that. Similarly, on dairy barns where there's concentrated emissions, there's methanovores, microbes which eat methane and release, various things. But you can actually put processing systems on the ventilation to demethane remove the methane from the stack in dairy barns where you have concentrated sources. We need to put bubblers under hog manure ponds to make sure they decompose anaerobically. There's a bunch of changes there, but they're not hard to do, and they're really obvious. There's no solution. There's no pieces here where we have to change our diets. We just have to tweak some stuff with farmers and pay them for it. Farmers are kind of at the wrong end of the stick in terms of the value chain. There's like 20 middlemen between farmers and grocery store shelves where people are adding costs. Frequently the farmers' products are under 5% of the cost that we pay at our end. So we need to pay them more and help them change. Back to critical minerals. We have all the critical minerals necessary for decarbonization. I used to work for a global technology consultancy. And if I was working on a bid in Canada, I'd bring in the Australians because Australia is also a big minerals company. But if we were working outside of Canada, I'd bring in the Canadians, just because it's like exotic from away. But we have enormous depth and breadth of critical minerals skill and the amount of raw materials. If any of you have been fighting against mines in the past, please stop. Dan should be supporting mining in Canada, hard rock mining in Canada, for the critical minerals necessary for electrification. They need to be done responsibly. We do that responsibly in Canada, but they are necessary for fighting climate change, and we can be a powerhouse for the world. As a matter of fact, at one point, Quebec hard rock mining of lithium was the biggest source of lithium in the world. We have the minerals that are necessary. And we need to power that with clean Canadian electricity. Basically, it's all stuff that's amenable to clean processing with electrons. I'll say this again. There's no hair shirts involved in what we need to do for Canada. There are some changes. You plug in your car at home when you get home, and it's plugged in and it's charged overnight in low demand periods. We get heat pumps instead of gas furnaces. We get on electric buses, and when I call an Uber, we get an electric car instead of a gas car. We still have warmth, we still have heat, we still have all the food we love. It's just a lot lower carbon. But and this is all very amenable. Now, there's a bit here that I'd like to talk about, which is something that SCAN can lean into. There's a social psychologist out of the States. His name is Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. And he has something he calls the moral foundation theory. He and his fellow researchers have done a lot of analysis to say, how do people make decisions? Now, I'm just going to assume that since this is not seniors for oil sands now, but seniors for climate action now, you probably, like me, lean into the progressive end of the political spectrum as opposed to the conservative end of the political spectrum on average. And this is a spectrum. It's a continuum, not a black or white. But one of the things Haidt's research found was that we as progressives, most of us, my assumption, so please forgive me if you really love Pierre Poilievre, but we focus on care and fairness in our moral assessments of things. Those are the two moral foundations we lean on. We still think about loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty, but we weight them lower. Now, Haidt's research finds that conservatives also weight care and fairness, but they weight them equally with loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty. So if you've got a communications initiative, you've got a PR campaign or an ad campaign of some sort, where you're just trying to get messaging out there, what this means is if you lean into the default of care and fairness, you leave some moral foundations on the table. And the recommendation I make is for any given messaging that you do to pair one of care and fairness with one of loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty, so that you're hitting both sides of the spectrum. And consciously think about getting the loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty aspects in there. And right now, that's easy. I'll give you a key example. Right now, the world is suffering an energy crisis. It's second one in 4 years. And to be clear, one in 14 since the OPEC oil crisis. Every 4 years, on average, we have a global energy crisis. During that period, energy resiliency, energy security, and energy affordability become hot topics. And there's nothing more resilient, affordable, or secure than electrons generated with wind and solar and water inside our borders. So if you want liberty, well, liberty from high gas prices is right there. So there's all sorts of ways you can just tell that story. Affordability, right now, Spain and Pakistan are not suffering nearly as high gas prices and energy prices as the rest of the world, because they've hammered in a lot of renewables, different ways to get there, but they are actually weathering the storm of the current crisis better than most, especially Spain, because it's got a good mix of wind, solar, and a pretty robust grid. I mean, I'll just say, while it went down last year, they got it back in 12 hours. That was an extraordinary response. That was, much better than we did in our ice storm days. And so, yeah, there's a book on this. I recommend you to read the book. And there's a cheat code for this, which is for any messaging you do, say, oh, the Chat GPT or Gemini or the favorite LLM, your LLM of your choice. How can I add more moral authority messaging in here, and just get it to give you paired messaging stuff, and it'll help you with that. What LLMs are perfect for this kind of thing. So that just means that you're going to be more effective. It's not pandering to the conservatives. It is meeting them on their ground and maximizing the likelihood that they're going to hear the messages you want to bring along. That's my slides. I got through them a bit quicker than I expected, which is great, but it leaves more time for questions. So let's move to questions.
My audio back on here. So generally it's a mix of hands up and let me see what's in the chat. Let me look at the chat first of all. I've got something. Here's an interesting one, which I talked about recently. There's a question here from someone who is tempted to purchase a Skywind energy wind turbine to put on his roof. Now, I think I know the answer to this, but what do you think, Michael, about this idea?
Well, let me just look at the Skywind turbine first of all, before to give you, oh yes, that one. Okay, the short answer is that wind energy needs to be big. The wind turbines in wind farms or 10 kilowatt systems, it needs to be away from turbulence. So if you've got a nice big field with good wind in the big field and you can put up a 100-foot mast and put a 10 kilowatt turbine at the top of that from Bergy Wind, fill your boots. But wind energy on top of buildings is just greenwashing. Don't waste your time and money. You won't get much out of it. It'll be noisy, it'll creak, it'll break, and you'll be annoyed. So don't do it.
I'll echo that, please. Do not do it. Let's turn to Jane. Jane, you have a question. I can see that you're in the top right, top left-hand corner. Brilliant.
Learning lots, but I don't understand the first slide. It looked like nuclear and biofuel was going into wasted energy. And I suspect I don't understand what you were showing as the energy that wasn't useful in the bottom right corner.
Sure. So nuclear is a thermal generation study. We use the heat from the decay of uranium to boil water. And then we put that through a steam turbine to generate electricity. And that means that of the heat that we generate, only about 40% turns into electricity, right? And so that's 60% goes into rejected energy. For biofuels, the only thing we need biofuels for in the future is crossing oceans. All Great Lakes shipping and hybrid electric aircraft turboprops of up to 100 people and 1,000-kilometer trips are viable, but crossing oceans, we're still going to need liquid fuels. They're going to be biofuels. We're going to need biofuels for our big ships and our big jets. Big jets are about 50% efficient when they're at cruising speed at 38,000 feet. But when they're on the runway, and so that's 50%, so 50% rejected energy there, of the fuels we put in. But if they're on the runway, it's like you got a big hose and you're just pouring kerosene on the runway. There's just nothing going on there. And climbing, they're not nearly as efficient either. And so rejected energy is heat energy that doesn't turn into forward motion for a plane or a ship. And so the biofuels go through their processing. There's some inefficiencies there, but then they go into transportation, jets and ships, and there's losses there.
Richard Langley, you have a question.
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious your thoughts on the SMRs that the Ford government wants to put in Ontario. I'm not quite against it myself, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, let me put up a slide I had prepared just in case someone asked about nuclear. Or is it that one? Okay. Believe you can see my slides again?
Yes.
Okay, so I've been paying attention to nuclear for a long time. I like nuclear as a 1970s technology. I understand it. It is safe, it is low carbon, it is low pollution, fears of radiation are overrated. However, it's slow to build and it's expensive to build. And because of the nature of the technology, it is higher risk for going over schedule and over budget. Even China, which eats mega projects as mid-morning snacks, has only managed to not have nuclear become more expensive. It hasn't broken the cost curve and brought it down. I started in 2014 tracking the global experiment of nuclear versus renewables in China because it was a nice natural experiment, because they had none of these Western environmentalists who hated nuclear, and they didn't have the regulations, and they could do whatever they want and blah, blah, blah. And even they can't build nuclear particularly fast. They're averaging 0 to 3 reactors a year these days, and they're still under 2% of grid capacity with nuclear. Meanwhile, they're at 60% capacity with wind and solar. They started their nuclear program in the 1970s, their commercial generation program, and they only started their commercial wind and solar program in around 2004. So, after we can look at that natural experiment, and renewables are going up exponentially in terms of every year they're deploying more and more and more, and nuclear is flat along the bottom in terms of real generation added per year. And the reason is these are the conditions for success that have worked in the past. Ontario built its nuclear fleet in part because of the military advantages of processing uranium for the United States for its nuclear weapons. There's a part of that was embedded there, and it had a lot of strong national support. And I don't see a jurisdiction which is actually recreating these conditions for success, in part because very few of them are actually, wanting to become nuclear powers. We actually made the decision in the 70s or 80s to not be nuclear power, not be a nuclear thing. We sell a lot of uranium to people who do make nuclear weapons with them, but that's a different thing, I suppose. But small modular reactors specifically, you notice the single proven gigawatt scale design? That's what's worked. In the United States, they've got 50 reactors, 2 designs, and they just built 50 of each about, right? You got to build dozens of gigawatt scale things. Why gigawatt scale? Well, we actually started by putting nuclear reactors that we put in nuclear powered submarines and nuclear powered aircraft carriers and just built them on ground. But what they rapidly discovered is the electricity was too expensive. There's a bunch of engineering connectors and fiddly bits that just means if you want cheap electricity, you kind of have to scale to a gigawatt scale. Now you can see that with the small modular reactors because they're getting bigger and bigger. They were talking about 20 megawatt nuclear reactors. Now a small modular reactor is 300 megawatts. And we've got experience with 300 megawatt reactors. There's a whole bunch of CANDUs in India that were 300. Guess what India is doing? Well, they're building gigawatt scale CANDU reactors now, not 300 megawatt scale reactors. They're not going to be cheap. Honestly, my strong assertion about nuclear power in the 21st century, given the pure example globally of the success of wind, solar, transmission, and storage in solving the problem, is that it's an intentional delaying tactic by conservative politicians who can no longer deny climate change. They have to have a climate solution, so they defer any real action by saying our climate solution is nuclear power, and they kick the ball down the road. You can see that in the Ontario, where they're going to be building more gas and burning more gas the next 15 years while their mega project goes over budget. I'm not a fan of nuclear, and I'll say this again. I'm a fan of nuclear as a technology. If a country was actually building the conditions for success and being overt about them, I'd be all for it, as long as they're building wind and solar as well.
Thank you, Michael. Moya, you're next. Do you have a question? You're on mute, Moya. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. There's no end of really good examples of what could be done. And I think that the biggest barrier you hit on when you were talking about methane emissions, the lack of political will. And it's pretty frustrating right now to have a federal government that has done things like cut green home standards and incentives, cut from the budget for public transit, and incredibly frustrating in Ontario dealing with the policy for nuclear. And several years ago, I was talking with a climate scientist who specializes in transportation, and she had done a lot of really good work on the carbon burden of building public transit as compared to other things. And you know, we said to her, why don't you make a lot more noise about this? And she said, well, I want the science to speak for itself. So what I want to know is, when are the scientists going to start speaking out? When are the engineers who know a lot about this stuff going to start speaking out? Because it's not just the really good examples that exist. I mean, even down in the United States, there are 28 states right now that are about to enact legislation to allow balcony solar.
Moya,
Yes.
may I answer your question so that we can get to somebody else's
please.
question?
Thank you. I'm sorry. Long-winded.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
So I know Michael Mann and Mark Z. Jacobson personally.
Two of them.
I know, but I'm about to tell a story about Michael Mann and Mark Z. Jacobson. They've both been sued for defamation.
Wow.
They've both, Michael Mann won his case. Mark Z. Jacobson lost his case and is facing a $500,000 US judgment. The amount of money that's spent on litigation, which is solely intended to shut people up, is very strong. The well-funded fossil fuel industry and its enablers is unfortunately very powerful. So Michael Mann is fearless. I respect him tremendously. Mark Z. Jacobson, ditto. But it takes a special kind of person to stand up and become a lightning rod. And should we really expect our scientists, the people who are advancing knowledge, and the engineers who are building stuff, to be the people who are always the lightning rod and the communicator? As I was saying to Jim earlier, Jim and I were laughing before we started about the ability to communicate, because he's been trying to learn how not to sound like an engineer for years. And to be clear, that's why I close with the moral foundation stuff. The moral foundation stuff enables you to communicate and create more movement and more political will for more of the solution set. So one of the things we failed, there's two things that progressives have failed at in our communications. One is assuming that giving people information would mean they'd make better decisions. It's not the way people work. The second is communicating to ourselves about caring and fairness, as opposed to also including the other moral foundations to draw in conservatives more into the stuff we care about. So this is what we can do. I think it's unfair to ask the people, the scientists and engineers, to be the great communicators who move the needle on other stuff. There are other people for that.
Jim, did you have a question related to this topic? Otherwise, I'll pass it to...
I do have a question, but I'll just I appreciate Maura bringing that up, and I just wanted to share. I appreciate Michael's comments. I've screamed my head off for 35 years. There is an incredibly wealthy industry that works so hard to shut us all up again, and I've come very close to being sued, and I've managed to just stay, probably because they don't want to make a martyr out of me. But anyway, that's as much as I'll say. I will come back with my question when my turn comes. Thanks.
Okay, then we'll turn to Ron. Ron has a question.
Yes, there's a proposal for a high-speed electric passenger rail between Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City. And I've heard that there is a lot of opposition in the rural areas as they're concerned about agricultural land being removed. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I did the math on this, not the agricultural land part, but the population density for an equivalent distance line in China versus the population density in Ontario. It's about half. So we have about half the people that could be served by high-speed rail. Second, in China, as in Europe, there are feeder rail systems that bring people to the high-speed rail, and we have none of that. Third, in China and here and in China and Europe and India, they have cultures of using rail as opposed to cultures of private automobiles. We have the opposite. Fourth, I mentioned hybrid electric aircraft. I've flown out of Billy Bishop Airport in Toronto Harbor to go to Montreal a bunch of times because I had, work there and stuff. That's route, which is strongly overlapping the two dominant cities that would be served by this high-speed rail, is very amenable to hybrid electric turboprops in a few years. Unless hybrid, the fifth thing I'll say is right now California's high-speed rail, it wasn't the farmland that was the problem; it was the city centers. If they're actually terminating one end of the rail 140 miles from San Francisco, and the other end is 40 miles from LA. This is not door-to-door rail from city center to city center, and I suspect we'd end up with the same problem in Canada. You just need more stuff. So I like rail. When I'm in Europe, I use rail all the time. I've got a couple of years ago when my wife and I spent a bit of time in Toronto and a bit of time in Montreal, we took the train. We took Via between Toronto and Montreal. But I don't think it has the conditions for success in Canada.
Yeah, that's an interesting that we need to talk more about this. It's an interesting point of view. It's a controversial proposal, isn't it? So I have a question now from, is it Lynn? Lynn
Yes.
Holden.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for that answer. Because I live not too far from that high-speed rail route in Prescott County. And so I'm wondering, generally, for a high-speed rail or for transmission corridors or pipeline corridors, any of these corridors, how do you prevent the area that those things travel through from becoming sacrifice zones? It has appeared to me that in my area, if the high-speed rail goes through, we are in a way a sacrifice zone because there's no feeder transit or any buses or anything to help people actually get to the city so they can take the train that's going through their field.
I think the term sacrifice zone is a wonderfully emotive, emotionally laden, inaccurate statement. You're doing a great job of communicating your distaste for high-speed rail and bringing in specifically the moral foundation of sanctity. And I think people who need to create social license among communities like yours have to do a much better job of communicating the value propositions and giving community benefits. So congratulations on effective messaging to block a strong value proposition, which I think is wrong for a different reason in Canada. For transmission, I in general don't have a lot of time for NIMBYs because they use a lot of terrible communication stuff, which is inaccurate, and I have problems with disinformation. It's just who I am. But that doesn't mean they're not effective communicators. If we want to get this stuff in, and I've coached people, I've dealt with anti-wind stuff globally, including in Ontario, which is more anti-wind and health lawsuits in Ontario than any other single jurisdiction in the world because of the disinformation by NIMBYs. So we've got to get better, and we've got to share the benefits. And we've got to find ways to, when we're doing major projects like transmission, which is absolutely necessary, we've got to be able to communicate them effectively across moral foundations to draw local citizens who might feel they're in a sacrifice zone in.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michael. And Don Booth, you have a question?
Yeah. Can you talk about Great Lakes wind?
Sure. a matter of fact, on the Great Lakes Wind is why I've had lunch with Margaret Atwood, just me and her twice. Random story. The Great Lakes Wind is a great idea. It's perfectly sensible. We've got great wind resources. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald should tell us that the windstorms that push the water up levels up so high in Chicago should tell us that. The fact that people who'd see some blinking lights out in the middle of the lake got to block it just pisses me off. The fact that people were able to make a bunch of nonsense arguments about bird safety pisses me off. It's something we should be fighting for. We have a tremendous resource. We could have a Great Lakes wind industry that could be powering Canada and the United States. This is something that is an obvious industrial and electricity strategy. It creates every wind farm in the world, when it's operating, it creates habitat for fish. Seabirds, every study I've seen, radar studies, seabirds fly around wind turbines. Songbirds, when they're migrating across the lakes, migrate at 5,000 to 6,000 feet. Raptors, when they're crossing at Point Pelee, they soar up to 10,000 feet and then they coast down, crossing the Point Pelee landmass at about 2,000 feet. There is zero harm to birds that is specific. The biggest harm to birds right now is the oil and gas industry globally. It is causing major species devastation, major habitat loss. The arguments against wind turbines in Great Lakes do not hold water.
Let me echo that. Frank Johnston, you have a question?
Yes. To what extent do you believe that Canada is going to be an energy superpower, and that they seem to believe primarily that that's oil and gas and future exploitation of the tar sands? And there's a connection with moral authority and Jonathan Haidt's insight in that locally our Sunday event was the primary respondents were charismatic Christians who were interested in decarbonization and living off grid. And they had their children with them.
Okay, so Martin, I think you're missing Bill Barr. Maybe your screen is there because he's had his hand up in the upper left. So after this, we should go to Bill. So Canada's delusions of being an energy superpower are delusions. Somebody else needs to go on mute. Okay.
Can we mute everyone and we'll bring back the...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Thank you.
Okay.
So let's just talk LNG. I've done the modeling for the 5 proposed plants in the West Coast. I've also looked globally. Let's just articulate a few things. Pakistan, I mentioned earlier, it put in 32 gigawatts of solar over the past couple of years, and then it had to find homes for 24 full LNG cargoes last year that they committed to Qatar for long-term contracts because they didn't need them, because solar and batteries eats directly into LNG. Right now, this Strait of Hormuz disaster that's unfolding means everybody is looking at Pakistan and Spain and going, we want us some of that. We want to have less energy flowing across our borders and more secure, resilient energy from inside of our borders. A single container ship of solar panels from China avoids 50 tanker ships of LNG over the 30 years of a life. And so everybody's looking at the electrostate stuff and looking at that. And here's some proof points. India and China are 2 of the biggest countries in the world, 1.4 billion people each. Obviously, as a result, they consume more energy than most other countries. At the beginning of last year, before this current energy crisis, their LNG imports went down by double digits. Canada's belief that the world is going to be a growing place for more gas is delusional. I think that the one that exists right now and the two that have reached final investment decision will see it's about a third of total proposed capacity will actually be built. But I think that one of them will be actually shut down in 2041 at the end of its 15-year contract. And the other two are likely to be diminished substantially after that. There's a limited lifetime for LNG. On gas, about 98% of our oil, 98% of Alberta's product goes to the States, where it makes diesel and gasoline. We are not an exporter to the world, we're an exporter to the United States. That occurs right now because the United States in the 2000s, early 2000s, turned all of its refineries into heavy sour crude refineries before the shale oil revolution. Now the shale oil, the fracked oil, that all gets exported because they can't refine it. Now imagine a world where there's diminished oil demand and aging refineries, and the United States wants to stay on oil. Is it going to keep importing Canadian crude, or is it going to demand domestic markets, a national energy program, or its domestic crude? Canada's crude is the most expensive stuff going. It's the most expensive to distribute. It's the most expensive to refine, and it produces very few of the petrochemicals which will persist when we stop burning fuel. It's going to be first off the market. And so our belief that we're going to be an energy superpower with oil and gas is delusional.
Bilbao, you're up. You're on mute. You take yourself off mute. There you go. Oh, you're back on mute again. There you go.
Okay. So, air-to-air heat pumps, as far as I can tell, do work to -30, I've heard. But once you get below zero, then it costs so much in electricity that a lot of people are less well off. Have you a solution for that?
Two
or is
solutions.
that wrong?
No, it is right up to a point. So you live in Edmonton, and Edmonton is in Alberta, which has the second highest electricity prices in Canada. So that's problem one. Problem two is you've got the cheapest natural gas prices in the world. Right now, the Western Basin, natural gas is, the utilities are basically giving the gas away and paying for the distribution and their profits. It's about 17% of your bill is actually gigajoules from natural gas. The other 83% is just the gas paying for the gas network. That's going to change. Those natural gas exports, by the way, are going to actually make natural gas in Alberta, especially, about 3 times to 4 times more expensive. So that 17% is going to go up. That's because right now it's a landlocked reserve. Once it's exposed to global price arbitrages for energy, the price of natural gas is going to go up, just as it did in the United States, which caused the Biden administration to put a hiatus on building new natural gas export terminals. And so the natural gas advantage is going to diminish. The policy approach that we talk about globally is to reduce that spark gap. Right now, if gas is cheap and electricity is expensive, you don't get any benefits, fiscal benefits from heat pumps. We have to invert that. In Germany, they're now, where they traditionally had very high energy prices to promote efficiency measures, they now have 6 euro cents per kilowatt hour industrial electricity, and they're working on that. In Australia, there's now 3 hours every afternoon in one of the states where the electricity is free from the grid. And so what we have to have is policies that reduce the price of electricity, increase the price of gas to reduce that burden. And secondarily, there's some stuff you can do even then. So a hot water heat pump can take electricity when it's cheap, store it as thermal load, and then be used to do space heating in the evening as well. And so you've kind of got some opportunities to do some load balancing. But also in Australia, or sorry, also in Alberta, Jim, this Okotoks, I think it's north of Jim and south of you, Bill. Okotoks for 20 years had thermal seasonal energy storage. They used thermal solar and they put hot water through a loop into a geothermal store and they'd bring it up in the wintertime. And they got to 95% of community heating in the wintertime from heat from the summertime. Seasonal thermal energy storage works brilliantly in the north. There are about 3,000 of the systems in the Netherlands alone, and they're used extensively. And so putting heat into thermal stores in the summertime when we've got too much of it and need air conditioning, and taking it back out again in the wintertime works brilliantly, and it's being used globally. We even have an Edmonton proof, an Alberta proof point. So yes, air source heat pumps do work less efficiently. They're getting better and better. And yes, if your electricity prices are high and your gas prices are cheap, yes, it's going to be more expensive to run.
Jim, you're next. You have a question?
Okay, thank that. That was a great answer. For anybody who wants, I actually have a really like a 2-paragraph analysis. I've had a ground-based heating and cooling using heat from the since 2006. I can send you the numbers on it. Mike, I always love when you talk about mass timber buildings. And I think it's I'm wondering, this is something I haven't been able to investigate. So if hopefully you have, couldn't British Columbia, instead of shipping so many raw logs, and I'm not sure the percentage anymore of just literally raw logs that leave British Columbia and other parts of Canada, couldn't we literally start to design almost apartment buildings that would fit in 1 or 2 shipping containers using mass timber, and ship them around the world in shipping containers? Tell me what I'm missing there, or if I am.
Mostly no. We have a potential for a market in Japan. But it is mostly a regional thing. What we need is a source of lumber. We need a regional high-tech infrastructure for mass timber design and construction, and then it's road delivery, for a few hundred kilometers. So in British Columbia, we have the northwestern market and down into Washington State. In Ontario, we'd have Ontario and down into Michigan, I guess, and New York State. And New Brunswick, we could have a similar type of thing for the Maritimes. We're generally seeing they're bulky. They take up a lot of space. And so, they're not, if you're going to do a beam, you're not going to containerize a beam. Right. And at that point, if we're getting into shipping, then we're competing with places like Uruguay, where somebody I know has a mass timber facility. And so you start to, because this is a purely democratized thing. Now, we do have an advantage. There's I think last time we spoke about mass timber, and said, where do you put the regional hubs? Where do you do that? But it is more of a bit more regional, just simply because of the unwieldiness of putting masses of mass timber and containerizing things. That doesn't mean it's not possible, but you get into constraints around the modularity, which means that you've got constraints about what people can at the end can build with what you're doing. So I don't think in my analysis, when I did, and anybody who wants can look up my mass timber report from last year. It's like 130 pages or something. I go through the regional industrial supply chain approach, and it's very Canadian focused. So don't think so, Jim. But yes, reasonable question to ask. And by the way, in terms of timing, I've got another 20 minutes before my stomach says, go feed yourself. So I'm going to keep answering questions for at least that long.
Okay, I think we're good for a few more minutes. Elizabeth, you have a question.
Hi, Michael. That was a great presentation. Thank you. My question is more about communication and SCAN's impact. So I like the moral foundations. I'm going to go read up on that. Do you have a sense of whether we should be focusing more on the possibilities and helping other Canadians learn about renewables and how inexpensive they are and so forth, that they can take action individually and also with their own municipalities and so forth? Or should we continue some of the things we have been doing, which is, asking the government to make changes, down with fossil fuels, that kind of stuff? Do you have some sense of what's more impactful or what might work more effectively for us?
So there's 3 or 4 answers, which means you're not going to get a clean answer from me. But I'll say this very clearly. If you can change people's votes so that they vote for better parties. I mean, somebody was, understandably upset with some of the imperfections of the Carney government, but it's the best choice going. It's a lot better than the alternatives. So voting is important. Talking to your MPs about some of these things is good, but people do what's easy, and people do what's available to them as options. Is the second answer, and I'm very bullish on giving people better options as opposed to trying to get them to put on hair shirts. A heat pump for the vast majority of Canadians is a better option, but you got to make it easy for them, and you got to make it harder to get a gas furnace. Like in British Columbia, in Vancouver, where I am, they prohibited new gas furnaces in residences that were built after 2024. So heat pumps, and you've got to make sure that homes that are set up to be built, multi-unit residential or otherwise, are solar ready. Right. And so those are changes in regulation. Those are changes in zoning codes. Those are changes in policy. I think there's, generally speaking, I think it's better to create better choices for people productively. But that's me. There's a million ways to skin this cat. And frankly, for each one of you and every organization, you've got different strengths and weaknesses. I spend a lot of time. I've got I've got one NGO. Well, I helped set up 2 NGOs in Europe last year. And one of the things I did is I helped them with strategy. I said, what is the reality of the situation around this? Given the reality of the situation, really making sure that we clearly understood the reality. That's important. What policies should we have about riverbanks for how we respond to this reality? And by that, I mean, take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the risks. And third, create an action plan for actions around that. This is Richard Rummelt's Kernel of Good Strategy. It's the only book on strategy I recommend, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. And I would recommend that SCAN consider doing that kind of exercise to say, how can we be highest impact? But it's a non-trivial thing for individuals. I happen to be really good at being a broad spectrum nerd who knows a lot of stuff and researches stuff and communicates it. That happens to be what I'm good at. So be what you're good at that moves the needle.
Thank you.
On that note, Jim, you have a question. Jim Houston. Yeah.
Yes. My question is, we have a new passenger train in Ontario. I don't know if you're probably familiar with it. It's called the Northlander. It's supposed to run from Toronto to Cochrane. And part of the highlights that's being quoted about this train is that it's a new high efficiency diesel. I just wanted to see what your opinion is on high efficiency diesel. If you have a comment on that.
So I actually have an interesting perspective because I actually lived in Moosonee as a baby. So I actually took the train that went up to Moosonee.
Okay.
And I consider myself a Northern Ontario boy. I lived in Moosonee, Kapuskasing, and North Bay. So this is, part of my childhood.
All right.
But I'll compare and contrast with a different example. In Winnipeg, last year, they've been trying to decarbonize their bus fleet, and they were foolishly spending money and time on trying to make hydrogen work, which it doesn't. And so then they got to a point, though, where they're facing the transit death spiral. The transit death spiral is where something that transit agencies across the world are facing after COVID. People stop taking buses. and they stopped taking subways. So revenues dropped. And because they stopped, transit agencies couldn't afford to run as many buses. And so service got worse. And so then service got worse, so more people stopped taking buses. And when they considered going back to buses after COVID, well, the buses were really inconvenient, so they kept driving. And they made the decision, which I respect, in 2025 to buy 15 diesel buses to maximize bus service, because that would get people out of cars. A diesel bus is vastly more efficient than internal combustion cars. And so there's a parallel to be made there with the Northlander. Do I think that in the 21st century we should be building a new diesel train? No. But does it service people with transit that they don't have to get in a car? And will it get enough people off of the long drive from Northern Ontario that we can save emissions overall and save a few moose? Because, like my grade 8 teacher hit moose twice in 6 months. So imperfect, but better than cars.
Okay.
Okay,
Peter,
thanks.
Peter Nicholas. Peter, you have a question?
Yeah, very good, Michael. In Norway, I believe, the wind turbine generators, they painted one of the three blades black, and it supposedly reduced bird kills by 80%. Do you think, question A, do you think that would be happening in Canada? And question B, do you think we'll be using more solar thermal? So I know in Ridgetown, there's a long-term, like a retirement center, and they have thermal solar on the roof that preheats their laundry water and their domestic hot water, and has cut their hydro bill down considerably. So do you think there should be more of that going on in Canada?
Okay, to the first one, yes, they did the study. Yes, it reduced the very small number of bird strikes per turbine by a reasonable amount, and no, it's not worth doing anywhere. And the number of birds that are killed by wind turbines has diminished over the years as we've sited them better and as we've gone to larger turbines with slower moving blades and no lattice work things. The California turbines that killed a lot of raptors were put on the raptor soaring routes, and they had lattice work towers, so the raptors would perch on them and then fly into the blades. In 2014, they did a study of things. In the United States, there were 20 billion birds after nesting season. 10% of them were killed by anthropogenic causes. The highest number of anthropogenic causes were moving vehicles, lit windows, and cats. At the time, 1 in 86,000 birds was killed by wind turbines. 1 in 86,000. Wind turbines are a core solution for climate change, which is actually causing up to 50% species loss, including avian species. Putting restrictions on wind turbines above basic siting away from endangered species is a complete waste of time and effort. And anybody who complains about wind turbines and birds, ask, do you drive at 30 kilometers per hour on highways, and do you bell your cat? And do you keep your windows, drapes closed at night? If the answer to any of those is no, I don't believe that they're concerned about birds. So on the case of solar thermal, photovoltaic solar is much better and much more effective most of the time. Solar thermal can have some advantages. It works well with seasonal thermal storage, for example. But if you're going to put something on your roof, put solar panels, not big moving hunks of water.
Okay, maybe we have time for 2 more questions. So is it Crispin Kuntz? Is that 2 people?
I'm using Crispin's feed. My name is Reg. My question is about lithium. You talked about hard rock mining in Quebec. Here in Alberta, one of the byproducts of the oil sands is lithium, the quantity parts per million, also titanium, zirconium, things like that. I'd like to just touch on what's the value proposition of extracting lithium from the oil sands and the tailings ponds and the brine that's part of that process as well.
So there's a whole bunch of byproduct minerals from different mining extractions. There's stuff that we get like gallium, which we don't mine for, but it comes as part of mining for other stuff. And it has to be cost effective for us to extract it. That means the price needs to be high enough for it to be worthwhile. So in mining, there's a saying: the solution for high mineral prices is high mineral prices, because a whole bunch of mines get opened up and a whole bunch of alternative extraction approaches end up doing it. But in terms of mine tailings extraction, generally speaking, every mine has a different mix of tailings, and that's a very different mineralogical and chemical extraction process. As such, it's very difficult to scale it by having a technology which works in multiple places. So that's kind of problem one. Every brine deposit is different. Every set of tailings is different. The composition is different, and at different concentrations, you have to have different processes. So do we need to do it? Not really. There's a lot of better lithium brines than the tailings from the mine sands. There's other stuff that comes out of there that's probably more accessible. But frankly, a lot of the good lithium brines with high percentages of lithium are in places like Alberta. And so the same technologies which can be used to directional drilling to get down to the oil and gas can be used to get down to good high quality lithium brines. There's a startup in Alberta who's trying to do that. Not terribly successfully, but and one of the interesting things about lithium brines is they're often very hot. So you can run organic Rankine cycle electrical generation. They're doing that near the Salton Sea, and I did a techno-economic assessment of it sometime last year, and it made sense. They could actually make money from the electricity and the lithium extraction. So quite a nice little combination. So, but yeah, unconventional extraction is good. A lot of people claim tailings extraction. I haven't seen any good examples of it being economic.
Okay, perhaps two very quick questions then from Shirley and then from Terry Moore. Shirley, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to go back briefly to the high-speed rail. My understanding is because of the high speed, you won't be able to have any level crossings. And also I can understand, having grown up in a rural area, where freeways may separate, across someone's property. They don't all line up where you can line up a nice straight boundaries. So I don't understand exactly how that's going to work. I can understand their concern also and I'm wondering how that compares to the high-speed transmission lines. Electric line, I assume that's just towers and it's not going to affect a linear land underneath. I just wonder if you could comment on that, because I have trouble picturing how the high-speed rail is going to work.
Yeah, high-speed rail. I had this conversation. For any of you who read How Big Things Get Done, the business book of 2023 by Professor Bent Flyvbjerg, Danish knight of all things. And if you look at chapter 9, you'll find my name in there. He and his co-author used a bit of my research. I actually spoke to him about high-speed rail when I spoke to him a couple of years ago. And the challenge with high-speed rail is because of the speed, it has to go straight a lot more. So you have to tunnel a lot more than you do with normal rail, and you can't bend the curves a lot more slowly. And if you have to go over or under a road, you have to start a lot sooner. So your concern is right. These are engineering problems that are manageable, but they do add cost. It is part of the cost equation for high-speed rail. That's part of the reason I brought up the population density and the feeder rail lines and the culture. They have far from a guaranteed ridership that would make be cost effective. You either have to do it as a national project in the national interest because it's the right thing to do, and you establish the conditions for success for it, and you move people to the high-speed rail, and you eat the cost of it. That's what China did in a lot of cases. They've got 48,000, I think it's 48,000 now kilometers of high-speed rail, more than the rest of the world combined by a substantial portion. And a bunch of it doesn't make money. They're doing it because it was the right thing to do to speed efficient, low carbon, electrified transportation between their major cities to speed commerce and provide all the other values. We could do that. We could make that choice. In terms of land, eminent domain has traditionally been used for major projects. Here's fair market value, but that land is our land now. That's possibly what's going to happen. But as I say, I think that this is I think the fifth time high-speed rail has been proposed for the Golden Horseshoe. It's never succeeded before, and I don't think it's going to succeed now.
No, but it's not just a matter of a strip of land for an individual farmer if he can't get to the other side of his fields.
Shirley, I think we're going to have to wrap it up, Shirley. So
yes,
thanks for the question.
Clarify.
Terry has the last question. Maybe just a couple more minutes, then we have to bring it to a close.
So I wanted to go back to your comment, Michael, about stop opposing mining. SCAN has a history of joining forces with First Nations around the Ring of Fire, and we were many of us were extremely concerned with regard to the impact of that mining development on not only traditional lands of the First Nations involved, but also its environmental impact in an area which has got permafrost and so on. I want to just ask you, I mean, it seemed to be a categorical statement, but there's better mines than others. And the problem, it seems to me, is that many of the mining operations that Canadians and First Nations in particular have engaged with is very poor mining practices. And so, I'm curious, why would you suggest that we just simply stop fighting mines as opposed to stop fighting bad mining practices and just dumb projects?
Because in my experience, so it's not quite categorical. There's a lot of nuance, and it's an entire set of stuff. I mean, among other things, I did a techno-economic assessment of deep sea bed polymetallic nodule mining with a mining engineer last year. So I spent a fair amount of time looking at critical minerals. And yeah, there are a lot of bad projects, but there are a lot of bad projects that can be made better projects. And there's a lot of bad projects that can turn into strong benefits for the First Nations whose lands they're on. The problem is that a lot of mining is, don't mine here. A bad project by definition is a mine that's local as opposed to one that's in Indonesia where you can't see the harms. It's in a jurisdiction where there aren't regulations which can make better mines. And we in the West have outsourced pollution and environmental destruction globally because we've been opposing mining in the West. I think that's wrong. On a fairness perspective, from a moral foundations perspective, the fact that we can't see the people in Indonesia or the Congo does not mean that they are not being impacted. Secondarily, critical minerals mining is essential for solving climate change. Climate change is causing problems globally and for the North. You mentioned permafrost. I'm the only person I know who's wired 5 branches on permafrost and sent people to Inuvik 5 times. If you look at the North, the permafrost is melting and all the infrastructure is dissolving. The buildings are falling apart. That's because of climate change. I'm big on relative impact assessments, and I don't have a lot of time for NIMBYism. I am big on electrification because the negative externalities of climate change are much worse and much broader than the negative externalities of an imperfect mining project locally. So I would say take a nuanced stand, work for better projects with more sharing with First Nations. But if your predisposition is to oppose mines, then I would recommend strongly that you change that.
Okay. Well, it's 3:30. I think it's time to let Michael have his lunch. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's been very interesting, as it always is. It's really quite striking the way Michael started by we have all the solutions, and yet it is not happening. So really we need to interrogate ourselves, it seems to me. Why, when we know the solutions, are we not actually implementing them and deploying these technologies? So thank you again, Michael. I hope you'll come back again. I think that this has been 2 presentations that have been really, really interesting. And so I hope we will see you again. I don't know if Jim wants to say a last word. Let me just remind viewers again that I always check Clean Technica, where I know, Michael, you write quite often during the week. So I would encourage people that want to hear more about Michael's points of view and analyses to check out the website. It's called Clean Technica. There's lots of very interesting information there. So is Jim, are you still there?
Thank you so much. Yes, I thank Michael. Thank you to you, Martin. Great job of hosting. Thank you all for attending. And we'll continue to try to do things like this through SCAN and maybe make it a more formalized scheduled thing. So yeah, but those were great presentations, Michael. And I think just double checking with, I think Helen's still here, right? This talk as well will go on the SCAN YouTube. So, you can share this with your friends around the world, and let's get Michael a few million views on this in the next year or so. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you all.